Good afternoon and welcome back to the conference. The next roundtable that we will have is a roundtable on forest carbon opportunities. My name is Mark Pacheco. I'm the chair of the State Legislative Climate Alliance, which is co-hosting this conference with Scenic Hudson. I want to thank everybody so far for all of the wonderful work that staff has done to prepare the conference, and it's my duty now to be introducing the moderator of the next panel. And the moderator will be Dana Stein. Dana is a member of the Maryland House of Delegates and represents District 11 in Baltimore County. He was first elected to the House in 2006 and is vice chair of the Environment and Transportation Committee and chair of the Environment Subcommittee. Dana is the executive director and founder of Civic Works, a nationally recognized urban Peace Corps that transforms lives of young adults through community service. Participants rehab homes, build parks and gardens. They tutor and mentor students. They make improvements in homes of senior citizens and grow fresh produce at urban farms. Prior to establishing Civic Works, Dana practiced law for several years at Squire, Sanders, and Dempsey in Washington, D.C. He has a BA in government from Harvard University, a law degree from Columbia Law School, and a master's in public affairs from Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. And over and above all of that background of Dana, he's just a class guy if you get to meet him. So let me again thank all of you for being here, and let me turn it over to Dana.
Thanks very much, Senator. And I have to say right back at you. It's great working with you and with Rhode and CSG. And I really want to thank CSG for taking the lead in discussing nature-based solutions to the climate crisis and for sponsoring with Scenic Hudson this conference. It's, I think the idea of engaging nature-based solutions, be it ag or forestry or blue carbon, are really coming to the forefront of discussion at the state level and national level of how we can use them to fight climate change. In Maryland, we just wrapped up our 90-day session 10 days ago. And in the Environment Committee, of which I'm a member, the joke was that this session, it was all about trees. And that's because we had major tree planting initiatives in several bills. And we did end up passing a 5 million tree planting initiative with $15 million in funding for each of eight years, and also a bill to allow SRF loan guarantees for green infrastructure. And next year, I'm confident we'll pass a comprehensive conservation finance bill that the Chesapeake Conservancy has championed, and that'll work to connect conservation opportunities, be it forestation or other conservation practices with private capital. So what's happening in Maryland, I believe, is reflective of what's happening in many states and at the national level. So here with us to discuss forest carbon opportunities are at the state level and among NGOs are 3 experts. And I'm just going to introduce each of them right now and then turn the discussion over to them. Our first speaker is Robert Sherman. He's the state policy manager for the American Forest Foundation, a national organization that delivers meaningful conservation impacts by empowering family forest owners to take action on their lands. Bob is going to provide an update on the Family Forest Carbon Program and its expansion into the Northeast. Next, we'll have Molly Henry, who is the Senior Management of Climate and Health with American Forests. And in that role, she manages stakeholder engagement to develop and deploy new tree equity goals that optimize urban forests to deliver climate benefits and improve public health. And then third, we have Jody Saffeir, who is a Maine-based natural resource consultant who recently facilitated the Maine Climate Council's Natural and Working Lands Work Group to develop natural climate recommendations and is currently facilitating the Forest Carbon Program Task Force in Maine. So without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Bob Sherman.
Thank you so much, Delegate Stein. And let me get my screen share going. Just one moment. All right, can everyone both hear me and see the slides all right? All right, I will get going. So thank you all for being here today. Really excited to talk about the work that the American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy are doing with our Family Forest Carbon Program, leveraging climate finance to support America's family forest owners. So the first question folks might be asking is why even talk about forests as a climate solution to begin with? And as this chart really, I think, powerfully describes, is that nature-based climate solutions, reforestation and natural forest management are huge potential sources of carbon sequestration over the coming years. And natural forest management in particular, a way to deliver these climate solutions in a way that gets these tons of carbon sequestered at a lower cost than a lot of comparable methods. So then the question becomes, why family-owned forests in particular? Family-owned forests are key in large part because of what a large portion of American forests they comprise. Families and individuals own the largest portion of US forests at about 38%. That's more than the federal government or corporations or state and local folks. And this ownership group is vital to achieving meaningful conservation impact at scale. The issue is that these family forest owners currently are largely excluded from carbon markets. As you can see from this graph, the vast majority of registered forest carbon projects are on properties greater than 5,000 acres. Ownership of less than 100,000 acres is about 80% of American forests, but less than 1% of forest carbon projects. So where we come into this issue is the Family Forest Carbon Program. AFF and the Nature Conservancy have partnered to design this program, which addresses the obstacles that family landowners face in participating in these carbon markets. Our goal is to reach 20% of family-owned forest acres by 2030 and get at least 50 million tons of additional CO2 equivalents sequestered. These goals are also very much in line with a number of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, including clean water and life on land, as well as climate action. So to get into the mechanics of the program a little bit, one thing that is a major differentiating factor between FFCP and traditional forest carbon projects is that the landowners that enroll in this program are paid for specific practices as opposed for literal amounts of carbon sequestered. And I know that there's a lot to take in on this slide, but at the highest level, what we are talking about is carbon being monitored on a landscape scale to help spread the cost of monitoring and verification among landowners. What this means is that we can produce verified credits on smaller properties than have previously been possible, all while investing in rural America. We've been doing a pilot in the state of Pennsylvania for the last few years and have some really exciting learnings to share. The practices that our enrolled landowners were able to participate in were growing mature forests, which had to do with sustainable timber harvesting, as well as enhancing future forests, which included a slate of practices aimed at reducing competing and invasive vegetation. We offered these folks 10 and 20-year contracts, depending on the practice that they were undertaking. And really, we were very excited to have landowners in 16 counties in Pennsylvania with an average property size of only 150 acres. We were particularly excited about this figure, proving that landowners, whose holdings might be an order of magnitude smaller than what are traditionally available to sell carbon market credits currently, might have the opportunity to participate in an economic fashion with the help of the Family Forest Carbon Program. So as a direct result in Pennsylvania, because of this pilot, we anticipate the sequestration of 215,000 tons of carbon and have already committed to payments of more than 2 million to family forest owners. Our current pilot, as you can see, is in Pennsylvania and will be expanding to West Virginia and Maryland this summer. Later in 2021, we'll be expanding to the Midwest in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, as well as in the Northeast in New York, Massachusetts, and Vermont. In 2022, in the Northeast, we also plan on expanding to New Hampshire and Maine, and eventually in the coming years to Southeast and eventually nationwide. Some of our partners include corporations, as you can see listed on the left, that have both given philanthropic support as well as agreed to contracts to buy carbon credits, as well as folks on the implementation side like the Nature Conservancy, Vera, and Terra Carbon, who have been instrumental in getting the program set up. So lastly, I want to talk about the financial structure, and I know that this slide can look a little bit hairy, but I'm going to take us through step by step. And the reason I end with the financial piece of the program is this is really where the policy side of things comes into play as well. So the first step financially is that investors provide funds to a subsidiary of AFF called the Family Forest Impact Foundation. And through the Family Forest Impact Foundation, we're using funds raised from the private market to recruit landowners and help them implement sustainable forest management practices. The implementation of those practices then result in carbon benefits that are third-party verified and then can be sold to credits that enable FFIF to repay investors. Now, at the very beginning of the cycle, as you can see, are loan and/or bonds at 3% interest. And where policy comes into this is credit enhancement. In order to secure investments on terms we can sustain, we need companies to commit ahead of time through offtake agreements to secure these credit purchases. This means that we can offer de-risked investments and enable us to secure long-term patient capital in order to get the program up and running and then eventually scaled. So on the policy side of things, there are really a large array of options that we are looking at. At the federal level, we're working on the Rural Forest Markets Act, which was recently introduced by Senators Stabenow and Braun, and will enable the USDA to offer guarantees in support of programs like FFCP. But at the state level, as Delegate Stein had mentioned at the beginning, there are a number of opportunities for us to get these programs supported by policy as well. One area that we've identified as having a lot of potential for help is the Clean Water State Revolving Funds administered by every state. As Delegate Stein mentioned, we worked on a bill that would allow the CWSRF in Maryland to guarantee a bond issued by FFCP that could de-risk the capital and therefore allow us to scale with landowners in Maryland more effectively. Another option for a state policy intervention is the direct purchase of carbon credits by the state. This can mean direct contract buys and serving as a buyer of last resort. Finally, there are another other means that we can get into more in the Q&A perhaps. These are financial instruments such as concessionary capital, buffer pool participation, and offering production credits, as well as things less on the financial side of the ledger, like investing in forest carbon research, program facilitation and development, as well as investing in forestry workforce capacity. So with that, I will wrap up my presentation. Thank you again for the opportunity to be with you all today, and looking forward to our discussion.
Thanks very much, Bob. Great presentation, and like to turn things over to Molly.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to just share my screen quickly. Okay. Does that look all right? We always have to ask that, right? All right. Well, thank you so much, Delegate Stein. And we're going to move over to the urban landscape in this presentation. So this is going to be a high-level overview of our pilot project in Rhode Island, where I am based. And I'll be introducing some of the new urban forestry, climate, and health tools that American Forest developed and deployed as a pilot here in Rhode Island, and we are looking to roll out nationally. And I'll be mostly focused on the carbon aspects because of today's focus on carbon, but obviously there's a big public health component to this as well. And I'll be talking a little bit about how these tools can enhance opportunity for urban forestry projects to capture and store more carbon, and how these impacts are actually being measured and incorporated into larger statewide climate goals. So first, just a little bit about American Forests. We have both our American Relief team that works on conserving and restoring large forest landscapes, and I'm on the community relief team, which is focused on creating tree equity in cities across the United States through innovation, place-based partnership, and movement building. And we are also working with our policy team, who has been very active in leading critical forest-related policies, such as the Replant Act. And we co-lead the Forest Climate Working Group and the US chapter of Trillion Trees alongside the World Economic Forum. So the big challenge today is tree equity. We see this in our cities across the nation. Oftentimes tree canopy overlaps with income and race. And this inequitable distribution of tree canopy is closely linked to historical redlining and other racist practices. And when I say tree equity, just to give us all a common definition, American Forest defines it as every part of every neighborhood having enough trees to serve all residents' needs. And this has some pretty huge implications for health equity. And one of those is, one of many is looking at heat-related illness and mortality and poorer air quality. But today I'm going to be talking about how tree equity can help us achieve our climate goals. Right now in the US, our urban forests currently store an estimated 3.4 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide. And that is from a 2018 study out of the USDA Forest Service. We also know that urban forests can not only sequester and store carbon, but they can reduce our energy use on average of 7.2%. So we have a brand new study that's pictured here that is in partnership with the USDA Forest Service and Davey Institute that revealed that we'll need to plant 31.4 million trees each year in order to advance tree equity and slow climate change. And for the past 2 years, we've been working in Rhode Island to develop this proof of concept for connecting those dots between public health, climate, and equity. And thanks to Governor Gina Raimondo's leadership, who has now moved on to the Biden-Harris administration, but she is pictured here, she signed on to the U.S. Climate Alliance as a member state, Rhode Island, identifying urban forestry as our pathway for the Natural and Working Lands Challenge. And we have worked closely with the state of Rhode Island to develop and deploy a suite of urban forestry tools that can help the state in achieving its climate and health goals. This pilot is near completion, and we're getting ready to replicate it in other urbanized communities across the country. Just a quick snapshot of some of the major initiatives the state of Rhode Island is working on, looking at this circle here where the Rhode Island Urban Forest for Climate and Health fits into the resilience piece of the climate initiatives in Rhode Island. And it's also integrated into Resilient Rhode, which is Rhode Island's first comprehensive climate adaptation strategy, which is signed in 2018. So we have the tree equity score as part of our tools in the toolbox. And this is a standard way to measure how well a neighborhood or city is receiving the many benefits that trees provide. And to date, we have released tree equity scores in 7 locations, Rhode Island being one of them. And we're actually getting ready to roll out a national tree equity score explorer this spring that will include scores and data for 150,000 urbanized neighborhoods in the US. And this will give you the ability to compare how scores and priority indicators can compare to other neighborhoods in a specific city. It also provides a report at the state, municipal, and neighborhood levels to summarize how trees of select sizes can achieve tree equity. And they'll have some basic scenario planning as part of the reports and incorporate some things on the ecological benefits of your planting, but we're looking to build out a more robust scenario planting and impact reports into the next iteration of it. A little bit about tree equity score. It's essentially, you see here, I don't have enough time to talk about the methodology, but it combines the existing tree canopy. In Rhode Island, we use 2018 LIDAR data and compares that to the ecoregion. So historically, Rhode Island's at about 40% tree canopy. In a place like Phoenix, Arizona, it might be a 15% target. We factor the population density to keep it realistic and ambitious. We combine that with our priority index, which is income, employment, race, age, and surface temperature. They're equally weighted characteristics, and that gives us our tree equity score, which is normalized between 0 and 100 for every urbanized neighborhood. The higher the score, the lower the need for tree intervention, but the lower the score, the higher the need for tree planting. So I mentioned the Tree Equity Score Explorer, the national one, which is coming this spring. But we also have a deep dive tool here in Rhode Island called the Tree Equity Score Analyzer, and one that's in the making in Richmond, Virginia. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this, and you're going to start to see the connection to carbon in just a moment. So the Tree Equity Score Analyzer is really a GIS-based decision support tool to help you navigate priority areas for tree planting and to explore data. It combines data on climate projections, public health, and demographics to allow you to build scenarios to look at how that might impact your tree equity score. And the really powerful piece to this is the impact report that you get from that. So after you build your custom planting proposal, this will estimate the benefits of your tree planting project, including the carbon dioxide that's stored in your project after 25 years and on an annual basis, as well as rain interception, air quality, and energy savings. And all of this data is sourced from the City Forest Credits quantification tool, which I will talk about in just a moment. We also have a climate and health action guide. So after you've identified where you want to prioritize your planting, this action guide, which is on Vibrant Cities Lab now, provides a framework to create an urban forestry project that optimizes for carbon, climate, and health outcomes. And we collaborated with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science on this, and Dr. Kathleen Wolf from the University of Washington, who added the human health dimensions. It follows these main steps to develop sets of actions that can help you meet your urban forestry goals for those three areas: carbon, climate, and health. And it also follows the, if anybody's familiar with the adaptation workbook that the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science has, it's built off of that framework. Furthermore, as part of our deep dive work in Rhode Island, we worked with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science to develop this model species list to look at how we can combine climate vulnerability assessments with carbon benefits, health benefits, and health services in a way to inform practitioners on what species can be planted to optimize for different benefits that they're looking for. So for instance, if you're looking to maximize for carbon and minimize your climate vulnerability, you might use this list to inform your species selection, keeping in mind all the time biodiversity, of course. We also are working with City Forest Credits. They're a carbon registry based in Washington, and they're really unique in that it's an opportunity to leverage private sector dollars specifically for urban forests. And they offer a carbon credit protocol for both planting and preservation projects. And those funds that are generated from selling carbon credits can be used for maintenance or any future funding projects. There's actually no restrictions on it whatsoever. And for private investors not looking to get carbon credits, but are interested in quantifying the impact of their investment, we also have, City Forest Credits has this impact certification, which offers the 3 bucket, it's essentially a report card on these 3 buckets of health, equity, and environment, looking at a project and how it's designed. And we can actually include the Tree Equity Score Analyzer in the design of the project to award points. And this is just a sample taken from a planting we did with the Arizona Sustainability Alliance on an elementary school. And you can see, again, harkening back to that quantification tool I mentioned, there's carbon sequestration, rain interception, air quality, and energy savings that are quantified here. And at American Forest, we're really looking to integrate the impact certifications into all of our future tree planting projects. And we're looking right here in Rhode Island to implement some carbon credit projects as well. And then just to wrap it up, we are excited to announce that we are working with one community here in Rhode Island. They're part of the Health Equity Zone, which is out of the Department of Health. And they use the Tree Equity Score Analyzer and the species list to inform a 140 tree planting in a high impact neighborhood. And they are looking to wrap up that project as a capstone this coming fall. And we also were able to host this winter a learning lab, which is an interactive workshop where practitioners throughout the state of Rhode Island came together to learn about these new tools and to practice integrating them into real life scenarios. So with that, I thank you for your time and look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Molly. Wonderful presentation and very informative. Before I turn things over to Jody, I just want to ask you a quick question. The tree equity score for 150,000 urban neighborhoods that you're developing, when did you say that information will be released?
Yeah, the National Tree Equity Score Viewer will be out this May. So keep your eyes out. We're probably gonna do a big press release on it. We're just finalizing some elements. Yep.
Great, thank you. Okay, now I'd like to turn things over to Jody.
Great, thank you, Delegate Stein. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and you can let me know if you're seeing what I hope you're seeing. Can you see my slide of full screen?
Not yet.
Okay, let me go back out and go back out and share screen. There and there. And how about that?
Yep, we can see it now.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. Sorry about that. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about the process that Maine is going through right now. And it's a little bit different than the last two presentations where you were hearing specifics about existing programs. In Maine, we have an active process underway to design a forest carbon program. And so where I think this could be helpful to some of the participants today is if you hail from a state that is trying to figure out how to incentivize forest landowners of a smaller nature, landowners who have less than 5 or 10,000 acres, how might you go about a process to identify what is going to be impactful and what is going to motivate those landowners to become more actively engaged in their forest management? So, so I will just, spoiler alert, say that we are midway through that process. So I won't have answers for you as to what Maine is going to decide, but I can, I think, give you a thoughtful process to where we're moving in that direction. So just really quickly to give you a little bit of background as to how it is that a Forest Carbon Program Task Force even exists. This is the result of a decision that the governor, Governor Janet Mills, made in the middle of 2019 to establish a climate council that would be charged with figuring out an array of actions that needed to be taken to achieve Maine's climate goals. And those are to, by 2030, reduce greenhouse gas emissions to at least 45% below 1990 levels, and by 2050 to 80% below those levels. At the same time, to be trying to achieve by 2045 a carbon neutral economy. And so she developed, she established the Maine Climate Council, and it spent a year and a half of just intense work involving hundreds of people and it resulted in an action plan that was delivered to the state legislature just about 5 months ago at the beginning of December of 2020. Since that time, the legislature now is back in session, and there's been a flurry of legislative activity to advance some of the many recommendations in that plan. This was the structure of the Climate Council, and you'll see on the bottom right corner that one of the 6 working groups focused on natural and working lands and what those lands could do to capture more carbon and to add to ongoing mitigation. These were the overarching goals of the plan itself. And it was designed around 8 strategies, action strategies. And if you hone in on action E, protecting Maine's environment and working lands and waters and increasing carbon sequestration, that was the work of the Natural and Working Lands Work Group. And most of the recommendations that came out of that work group are housed in this part of the plan. So digging a little bit further into that strategy, it had many sub-strategies, one of which was identifying new incentives for increasing carbon storage. And it specifically identified establishing a forest carbon program as being critical to this effort. Just to give you a little bit of detail on the forest land composition in Maine, there are 86,000 family owners of forest land that are 10 acres and larger. 60% of those landowners are 65 years or older. So it's very clear that there will be a major transition in land ownership in the coming decade. But of that, of the land, about 5 million acres of it is held by this landowner group, 5 million acres of forest land in Maine. 77% of those acres are held by landowners owning 50 acres or more. So honing in on that demographic of between 50 and 10,000 acres is sort of the sweet spot that we're focused on. And the governor limited our focus to 10,000 acres because of, just sort of a determination that if you own more than that in terms of forest land acreage, that you could probably access voluntary markets without further assistance. So the governor issued immediately an executive order at the start of the legislative session and established a forest carbon task force to do a number of things. First, to sort of get a sense of what our current harvest levels and carbon stocking is on this acreage, and go through a methodical process of identifying carbon-friendly forest management practices and ways in which we can incentivize those practices to be implemented more broadly and provide the technical assistance that may be needed. It also recognized that Maine has an existing program, open space current use taxation program, that is underutilized and has not been updated in, frankly, decades. And so it specifically directed this work group, this task force, to think about ways that that program could be modified to further incentivize carbon sequestration. It acknowledged that there could be some benefits to working in partnership with other states, and so it directed the task force to look into that as well, and ultimately develop a numeric goal or target for increased carbon sequestration. So we're in the middle of this process right now. Meetings have begun. They began in February, and recommendations are due back to the governor by September 1st. And so the process that we've gone through so far, we've had 3 meetings out of 7 or 8 that we'll have. And it's really been to first make sure that we have a common language of understanding basic carbon sequestration principles, understanding the distinction between regulatory and voluntary carbon markets. But then also think about, with limited resources, what are the specific demographics that we should be honing in on? Should it be in a particular area of the state because of the potential to increase that much more carbon than in another part of the state? Should we be focused on a particular age group? And so it's really just trying to understand where we can get the biggest bang for our buck. We then moved on to understanding the range of technical understanding nationwide of the best forest practices that maximize forest carbon sequestration, and which of those are most logical to apply to Maine's forests given our unique conditions. We are just about to have our 4th meeting where we will be doing a scan of all forest carbon, up and running forest carbon programs in the country. Many are emerging right now, as you've heard, and so things are changing rapidly, but we basically will have a snapshot of the programs that exist currently and how they differ. We'll be eventually moving on to specific changes, as I mentioned, to our current use taxation program for open space, embedding carbon sequestration into the criteria for that program most likely, and then ultimately figuring out funding mechanisms as well, which we've been discussing all along. We'll be sure to be having an opportunity for public input as we do at all meetings, but also public input into a draft document. So I just want to end with this to just give you a little bit of a framework of how we're approaching this complicated issue. And first and foremost is just thinking about structurally, what is the best way to think about incentives? Should we be focused on any action that would provide a valuable measurable outcome in terms of increased carbon storage, or should we be essentially dictating an array of practices that we will be specifically encouraging landowners to adopt? If we go the avenue of being practice-based, what is that array of practices that we should hone in on? Because there are many. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, should a particular demographic be prioritized? And how do we approach technical assistance? So just for example, only about a very small percentage of Maine landowners, 27% forest landowners have a management plan. But if they have a management plan, 90% of those individuals actively manage their forests. And so one of the thoughts is to what technical assistance can be provided to this group of landowners to ensure that a far greater percentage actually has a management plan for their land. And then ultimately, how do we measure the progress being made at what level? And, you know, I can't give large predictions at this point because we just aren't far enough along in the process. But where I think we're headed is an acknowledgement that with limited resources, any type of evaluation at the parcel level is likely unrealistic, that we have an interesting opportunity to modify an existing program in terms of open space. So let's take advantage of that for sure, not exclusively, but definitely a piece of it. That unquestionably there is an interest in figuring out a way to provide greater technical assistance to forest landowners. Not really sure where the demographic issue is going to land. I think it might be difficult to, in some ways, prioritize one age group over another, or one particular location of the state over another. So I don't know how to judge that one yet. And I think there's a very deep interest in understanding, honing in on a limited array, a more limited array of practices. So that's where we're at right now. And this is the website to stay up to speed, up to date on where we're at. And certainly happy to have people reach out to me directly as well. Thank you for the opportunity. And
Great, thank you.
let me stop.
Thank you,
sharing.
Jody. Really like the process that Maine has laid out to consider opportunities for forest carbon, and could be a template for other states to consider. So thank you. Now we'll turn to questions, and we do have a number. The first one is for Bob. It's from Judith Schwank. how does she find out more about the Pennsylvania pilot? Who are your partners in that effort? So Bob, if you want to.
Yeah, happy to jump in there. And I should add that I think both Jody and Molly added their contact information at the end of their slides, and I'll be sure to add mine in the version of slides that get distributed so that everyone has my email address as well. But to answer that question specifically, we've really made sure in our establishment of the program, and particularly with the pilot in Pennsylvania, that we are talking to really the whole broad array of stakeholders in the state. So while the American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy are kind of the primary partnership in terms of actually enrolling landowners and establishing practices and then working out ways to sell the credits, we talk to folks in state government, we talk to folks in the conservation and environmental community, and we also have really good relationships with the industry folks in the state as well. Everyone has an awareness of what we're doing, and to the extent that it is possible, make sure that everyone is in agreement about practices and the best way to move forward and expand the program. But I'm also happy to make sure that when the slides get sent out, that I can send out some one-pagers and fact sheets that we have that both dive into the details of the Pennsylvania pilot in a little more detail, as well as things like the financial model and program history of FFCP.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Joe Kiernan. And Joe, since your question has a number of parts, I'd like to unmute you and for you to ask your question directly, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I have marginal cell service here, so hopefully everybody can hear me.
Yep, can hear you fine.
Great. So in the sense that land trusts may have thousands of acres of protected forest lands, and also acknowledging that sort of younger, more vigorously growing forests are better at capturing carbon, might it be wise for land conservation organizations who are, I would say, historically or traditionally not in the business of harvesting timber or managing their forests in that way? Is that something that might be advised or something to consider going forward? As older trees are certainly great at keeping that captured carbon, but if we have a greater need globally to capture the carbon that's in the atmosphere, might a younger forest do a better job of that? And then the other part of that question is, in the sense, or in the case of timber harvesting and lumber production and things of that nature with forest products, has there been any kind of analysis to compare the carbon footprint of the timber harvest and lumber production versus letting a forest kind of mature and have trees die and molder away and release carbon that way?
Okay, thanks. Who among the panelists would like to respond to that?
I'm happy to tackle at least part of it, and then Molly and Jody, if you want to add on, as I'm sure you will, feel free to do so. So to kind of answer the first part of the question, I think a lot of the best management practices, and I'm sure this is not a surprise to anyone, but are really going to be dependent on the specific forest and the ecology of that area. But you're absolutely right in that active management can often be the best way to ensure that the maximum amount of carbon is being sequestered. So part of the pilot that we ran in Pennsylvania, one of the available practices, the growing mature forests, was about making sure that timber harvesting that was happening on those lands is happening in a sustainable way. So at least for the Family Forest Carbon Program, it's not really about, putting a fence around these family forest lands and having them be untouched. It's really much more about active management that can promote forest growth and make sure that where it makes the most sense, we can get the most kind of bang for our buck in terms of management practices that are going to allow for growing forests that can sustain the maximum amount of carbon sequestration.
Mhm.
Molly or Jody, anything you want to add?
I don't think I have, I was going to play devil's advocate. I'm not sure it's fair though, that I absolutely agree with Robert that, active forest management is necessary to maximize carbon sequestration. In terms of a landowner group that I would focus on with limited resources, I'm sort of more excited about the potential that private land ownership can provide, given how little of that is under a forest management regime, and has such a larger potential to capture more carbon that it's just not necessarily a group that I would initially focus on if we're talking about smaller land trusts. If it's a land trust that has major forest land ownership, then I understand the gentleman's point.
Jody, I would just add, I think you had mentioned in your presentation that in the research that Maine had done, that a majority of, or at least a plurality of family landowners in Maine did not have management plans written, but the vast majority of those that did were actively managing their forests.
Precisely.
And I don't have the figures in front of me right now, but it's my understanding that we had a very similar experience with our learning pilot in Pennsylvania.
Okay, great. Thank you. And also, Joe, Sasha Spector just posted a comment that has some follow-up information as well in the Q&A section. Great. Our next question is for Molly. And let's see, this is from Ted Berger, who says that Molly's site is a cool idea focused on 8 cities now. How are you planning on aggregating and maintaining the tree data for this nationally? When is this expected and how will it be shared?
That's a great question. So this is not my idea. This is an American Forest tool, and it's all funded by Dorothy Charitable Foundation. Thank you very much, Sasha. To kind of simply put it, I am not the GIS and data science vice president at American Forest, but I do have a little bit of intel on how they're aggregating the data. We actually had a company called Earth Define approach us after we rolled out these first few tree equity scores, and they basically gave us an in-kind donation for all of these urbanized areas. Those 140,000 that I had mentioned across the US. And we're looking to use AI technology actually to update that data every 2 years. So again, this is a little more advanced than I can speak to because I'm not an AI expert or a data scientist, but that's the basics that I can provide.
Okay, great, thanks. Next question goes to the harvesting of old trees from Herb Conaway. How does one harvest old trees without killing a lot of other trees, young and old, and without greatly disrupting other components of the forest environment? So I don't know who would like to handle that one. Any takers?
I can jump in and just kind of say that part of the practices that we are looking into for the Family Forest Carbon Program, a lot of it at some level boils down to being anti-high grading practices, making sure that you're not exclusively going into a plot of woods and taking out only the largest, oldest, most valuable timber. But that's also to say that making sure that every single tree is left alone and there's not any sort of sustainable timber harvest happening is also not what we're looking at or not what we're encouraging as a best practice.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. And also, we have sort of a related question about mature trees from Tom Gilbert. What about recent science documenting the carbon benefits of allowing mature forests to further mature? Isn't that an appropriate management approach in some forests?
Yeah, I would think it is. And to that point, our practices that we're going to be using in the expansion states for FFCP are still under consideration. There are 2 that were available in Pennsylvania, will likely be available in some combination in other states, but we're also looking at additional practices to add to sort of the menu that is available to landowners. So all of that is to say that I am not myself a forester or much of a tree scientist, come from a policy background, but all that recent science in the forestry world is certainly being taken under consideration and a big part of how we're going forward with our methodology.
Yeah, and I think I'm out of my league here as well, not being a forester myself, but as I'm understanding it, and many people on this call, I'm sure, are more knowledgeable about this than I think the nature of these questions is sort of this balance between are you proving for the speed of sequestration, or are you proving for total carbon storage? And the answer to each of those questions is different. And so, if it's about speed, increasing, an increase of rapidly increased sequestration, then a younger forest is going to do that. But in terms of total carbon storage, having those large trees on the landscape is going to capture more ultimately. So it's a balancing act, and I think sort of disagree on what is that right mix, and it's very specific land dependent.
Okay, thanks. Our next question is more focused on urban environments. So maybe Molly, you might be interested in responding to this. This is from Andy Bicking, or it's really for the panel. Do you have any thoughts on ways to assess in advance 30 by 30 goals? That's protecting 30% of our open space resources by 2030 in urban environments. How could the tree equity score or other methodologies be applied in this context?
Yeah, I'll start it off by just saying I think the tree equity score is a very powerful tool, and that it helps us visualize where we can prioritize tree planting first and foremost, especially for those who are on the front lines of climate change. And if we are to prioritize, protecting 30% of our open space resources, why not look at the tree equity score and figure out where we can impact the greatest population that is most in need. So that's where I would see the tool being really powerful. Much further, as we look to advance our national tree equity score viewer, we might be able to actually quantify the impacts of those investments too. So again, gathering more investment from the private sector and the public sector.
Okay, great. And Jody, this is a question for you from Joe Kiernan. How is Maine working with large pulp and paper companies to manage their vast forest holdings to sequester carbon now that paper is less in demand?
I don't have an answer for you. What I would ask that you do is if you could put your contact information in the chat, and I will absolutely get the answer to that question for you, but I can't answer it, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. So yeah, Joe, if you could put your contact information in the chat box, that would be great. And I think we've got time for one more question, so I'm going to take the liberty of asking that. And CSG is, the Eastern region, obviously we have representatives from a number of states. Are there any economies of scale that could be accomplished if states work together on forest carbon opportunities? That's for any of the panelists.
Yeah, absolutely. With the Family Forest Carbon Program, with our expansion into the Northeast coming later this year, while every state obviously has its differences in terms of regulatory and legal regimes that will, in some cases, make it easier or harder for us to enroll landowners and to get capital flowing into the program, I think there is a certain amount to be said for uniformity among states, some sort of communication among environmental leaders and folks in state government about what practices make the most sense from a policy angle, things that folks can do to make sure that when programs like Family Forest Carbon Program want to expand into a state, that it is easy for them to do so, and make sure that the regulatory and the financial environment is such that there's space for collaboration and for conservation to occur at scale and with, whatever amount of speed we can actually achieve. I think that's really important. And I think I've certainly been looking to the work that has been happening in Maine as a sort of model for what other states could emulate. And I would think that there's a lot of potential for that sort of modeling and then also future collaboration to happen in the coming months and years.
Yeah, that sounds good. And Bob, not to create more work for Rona, but maybe CSG, the Eastern region, can be sort of a platform for, as you expand into the Northeast, developing those common protocols to make it easier for American Forest Foundation to expand your project into other states.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, when we have conversations with folks in expansion states, a lot of time the question we get is just, what can we do? This program sounds great, and what can we do to facilitate that? And our answer a lot of the time is it really depends state to state what those, facilitating factors are going to be. So if we can start working towards kind of a shared set of principles and goals where there's understanding between states about what those needs are, I think that would be extremely helpful, not just for our program, but in making sure that forest carbon and carbon markets are accessible in all of the states where there's significant presence of forests.
Agreed.
Yeah, okay, well, thank you. Well, that wraps up our panel. I want to thank the panelists for sharing your expertise and insights. It's been really informative. And I'm sure you're going to be hearing from a number of us, participants in the conference with follow-up questions. So thank you so much. And now I'd like to turn things back over to Senator Pacheco and Ned Sullivan.
Well, thank you so much, Dana, and I want to thank all the panelists in the last panelists and all of the panelists that have participated all day in our very first session relative to the natural and working lands. We have had significant discussion on sequestration opportunities. We've had discussions about what is taking place with our federal partners, looking at what the U.S. Climate Alliance is doing, looking at the National Academy of Sciences and other defined global opportunities for sequestration that was talked about in our first panel. We've had a roundtable on state healthy soils legislation, and we have had the opportunity to hear what has happened not only in Maryland, but also in New York State, in Vermont, in terms of what their agency is working on in agriculture and food markets. We've also had a number of great opportunities that will take place tomorrow. The last panel was in particular very interesting to me, because when you look at trying to make sure we retain carbon sequestration, that it stays sequestered, it's very important. And there's a whole debate about the older tree and the type of species and how long that older tree will take to decay, and all the carbon would go back out into the atmosphere. There's a lot of debate about that. So these are the types of practices, the best practices that we are learning from is something that we really need to share. And that's why we created the State Legislative Climate Alliance. And that's why Ned and others had worked to create the Northeast Carbon Alliance, working together and creating this alliance of states working on similar issues to come up with best practices and strategies that we can all work on together to meet these net zero by 2050 requirements that are going to come down, and the new federal requirements that will hopefully happen that we can achieve. So I want to thank all of the participants today that have participated with us. We were up to some very high numbers for our conferences that we've had in the past. And I want to turn it over to Ned to go over what we will be participating, what we will be doing tomorrow. We ask you all to join us again at 10 o'clock tomorrow to really get into the second day of this very exciting opportunity to exchange ideas and to find out what's happening, not only here in the Northeast, but also our Midwest and West partners are also participating. So Ned Sullivan.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. I share your sentiments that this was just an incredibly informative and exciting day, hearing what's going on all over the region that provides models for us moving forward and opportunities for us to collaborate across states to maximize the impact that we're having. Tomorrow, we're going to start off with a very important discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion in agriculture. We're then going to have an overview of the public and private carbon offset market opportunities, both methodologies and constraints. We're then going to hear from New York State's Agriculture Commissioner and the director of the state, the National Association of State Department of Agriculture, about what's happening in New York State and other states across the country and in the Northeast to advance natural climate solutions. And I think that'll be a very important opportunity also to think about how can the states cooperate with the Biden administration in natural solutions. And then finally, we're going to be looking forward and saying, what have we learned in these last 2 days? And how can we build those into an action agenda that will engage the states, collaborating with the federal government, collaborating with NGOs and others. So we're really excited. We hope people come back for more tomorrow. It is a Saturday morning, but we think it's a very important set of topics. And we thank you all for participating today and all your good questions and comments, and hope you'll be here tomorrow so that we can really set that agenda for regional action going forward. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you very much, Ned, and thank you, Rona Cohen, and all the staff of CSG. Everybody, we'll see you virtually tomorrow. at 10 o'clock.